I think I met the next speaker on an email. And the story was so compelling that I started to write to him, and that's why he's here, because it's a compelling story. This is another branch of the service's way of doing forward air control, and I wanted to hear it because it's from the current war and the ongoing war. And Stan Coerr is a... What? You know? Okay. And you can see he's got a warped sense of humor. You'll enjoy it. Stan Coerr, welcome from California. Thank you.
Good afternoon to all of you. As Zot said, we did in fact meet over email. I wrote a letter to the editor to a local newspaper, which ended up getting circulated around the internet and eventually was published in the Atlantic Monthly in the fall of 2004. And that was called No One Asked Us. And the idea behind it was there's a lot of talking heads discussing the war, pontificating about the way things should be or are not in theater, but no one ever asked the guys who actually went what they thought. Did you think you were doing the right thing? Did you understand why it was you were going? Does George Bush's rationale for going to Iraq make sense to you? No one ever asked any of us, any of the 500,000 people who went on the first go and the 1 million plus who've gone since then. So I wrote this article in response to that, and that is what Zot found, and that's how we actually got in touch with each other. So what I want to talk about today is, the schedule says Marine FACs in Iraq, but what I really want to talk about is Marine Corps and British forces, because as I'll explain to you, I went over there as a Marine officer on the ground, but I was actually there with a British unit. This was me during the war. I was over the border on the very first hour of the conflict, the border between Kuwait and Iraq. And this is what I looked like back in those long ago days. Notice the spoon right here. My Vietnam friends out here, I'm sure will remember these days of always carrying a spoon in your pocket. Towel around the neck for helicopter insertion and extraction type operations. And like all officers, of course, I spent most of my time on the radio. You'll see my Humvee here. This is the office. These are all my frequency cards. Picture of my son, who was 3 years old then. What you can't see is the big forest of antennas coming out the top of my Humvee, which of course indicated to every Iraqi sniper in the southern part of the country that there was an officer on board this vehicle. Here I am. This is in fact an AK-47. I'm one of those guys who was convinced if I went to the war with one of the Marine Corps rifles I was going to lose it. I didn't want to have that thing tied to me all the time, almost literally. So instead I picked up an AK off of an Iraqi that we took prisoner in the first couple days of the war. This is my lovely Humvee. It had 4,000 miles on it, and it was almost dead by the time we left. That's what desert warfare will do to equipment. Notice right here, this is what we call hillbilly rigging. And what we did was put all of our packs on the outside of the vehicles because we had so much stuff on the inside, especially my command vehicle. I was carrying a lot of radios, a lot of ordnance, that kind of stuff. So all our packs were on the outside. And this pack looks a little bit funny because my driver drove us through a puddle of crude oil at about 40 miles an hour on the way up across the border. So the entire right side of the vehicle was splashed with crude, and it's still in my uniform to this day, 4 years later. Not a very attractive sight, might I say. This is the war that we all experienced, those of us who were on the ground. My Vietnam friends, I only know about your war from television, from movies, from books, and that sort of thing, but this is the way it was for us. There was a lot of this in the background. And a lot of us are still dealing with health problems from breathing in all this crap in the air, burning crude oil. It's unbelievably filthy, unbelievably toxic. It wasn't quite the same as it was in Saudi Arabia in the first war, in Desert Storm. It wasn't quite that bad, but nonetheless it was really, really nasty stuff. I was carrying 3 weapons on my body at all times. I carried the AK, I carried a Beretta 9mm on my right leg, and on my left hip, you can't really see it, but I'm carrying a Gurkha fighting knife, and I'll talk about those guys here in a second. My background quickly. North Carolina native, I went to Duke, I went to Harvard for graduate school. I did that after the Marine Corps. So I went to Iraq, in other words, as a reservist, activated reservist. And I'm going to Naval War College next summer, top-level school. I have 9 years active, 9 years reserve, 18 years total. Most of my time in the Marine Corps, on active duty, I wanted to go down with the ground forces. I'm trained as a Cobra pilot. That's my background. But I understood, as all Marines do, that the real focus of the Marine Corps is the infantryman, the rifleman living in the mud with his rifle, sleeping in the rain, hoping somebody above him knows what he's doing. So I was always interested more in the ground forces and supporting them as a Coerr guy. And in fact, I did 3 air officer tours. Air officer for Marines is the equivalent of a FAC for my Air Force compadres. And I've done 3 deployments, 2 normal deployments and 1 combat deployment to Iraq. This is my background here, flying the Cobra off of the ship. This is in fact me in the front seat of this aircraft. And I put this on here to talk about a little bit of the naval character of what we did in Operation Iraqi Freedom. So I went from, in other words, I went from this nice, clean, air-conditioned sort of environment to this. Here's me briefing my troops. This is up on the Iranian border, the Iran-Iraq border. I'm going to get to this here momentarily, but I want to show you the way we sort of looked out in the field. Notice we're wearing soft covers. We're not wearing the helmets like the guys do in Baghdad now. And if you look right here, you can't see it in this picture, but this is actually a shamrock. I was attached to an Irish rifle battalion. So we wore shamrocks on our covers so we can get back and forth through the lines and not get shot up by the jumpy British forces. This is my team here. These fellas were primarily from Los Angeles. My reserve unit was 3rd Anglico, Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company. And as that name would imply, my job was to coordinate air, naval gunfire as a liaison either with Allied forces, in my case the British Army, or U.S. Army. In other words, we were all jump qualified. We usually go out with either the airborne forces or the Rangers. But in this war, we had so many people in theater that they knew that there were so many British forces moving north very quickly. They needed to have a liaison between British and Marines who were working side by side, often at night, in very bad weather with a lot of firepower. And they wanted to make that smooth. That's what I was doing. These kids primarily, as I said, are from Los Angeles, and primarily from the bad parts of Los Angeles. I had 25 Marines I took with me. More than half of them were Hispanic in background. These kids are mostly from the barrios and have made something out of themselves through the Marine Corps. These are good, solid, tough, salt-of-the-earth kind of folks, and I was proud of every one of them. Let's talk about Operation Iraqi Freedom proper. In the fall of 2002, the sort of war drum started to beat. And everybody knew this was all going to happen here very shortly. In January, late December, early January, 02 to 03, we started pushing forces forward, and we went over the border on the 21st of March. So in about 3 months, maybe 4 months, depending on where you start your count, we put about 500,000 people out on the desert floor. This is roughly the equivalent of taking the entire city of Albuquerque, picking it up and putting it out in the open desert, giving them power, water, food, ammo, places to live, places to sleep, mostly on the ground, and getting them all ready to go farther north up into Iraq. 230,000 Army folks, about 75,000 Marines, and then a good contingent of our Air Force brothers, and about 40,000 British forces as part of the 1st UK division. We took about 2,000 airplanes, and now again, I'm talking about the initial war, not Operation 2, 3, and 4. This is OIF 1. So these folks were the ones that got into theater first and got into the shooting match. And we were fortunate that we faced what General Zinni has called the only jerk who was stupid enough to go toe-to-toe with us out on the open desert. The only guy who took us on in the one war that we knew we were going to win. Airplanes and ordnance. Again, almost 2,000 airplanes. Over the course of Iraqi freedom, from March 21st to the 1st of May, these airplanes burned about 400 million pounds of fuel. They flew roughly 40,000 sorties. About 30,000 of those were ordnance dropping sorties in either deep air support or close air support to friendly troops. Out of that 30,000 sort of things falling off of airplanes, bombs, missiles, rockets, guns, about 2/3 of it was guided in some way. Infrared, laser, global positioning, internal navigation, or thermal or JDAM. I'm going to show you JDAM here momentarily. Another interesting point is the leaflets. 30 million leaflets dropped, mostly in the southern part of the country, saying, stay away from the buildings. If American forces come, don't shoot back or you're going to be sorry. Out of these 30 million, about 15 million of them ended up in the back of my Humvee, I think, because my troops all wanted to take them home and give them to all their friends. So I have quite a few. I can give Zod about 4,000 of them if he wants them. Here are some of the fellows that supported us. My F-16 friends are going to talk here later on, as I know. But as far as my war was concerned, the U.S. Marines and the sort of naval part of the war down the southern part of the country, these were the workhorses, the F-18 Super Hornet. Both Navy and Marine Corps flown off of the carrier as well as flown off of air bases in the southern part of Kuwait up against the bay. And this gives you an idea of the naval character of this campaign. At one point, as the war was building up and we were starting to go over the border, there were 5, count them, 5 carrier battle groups offshore, ready to support us. Now the problem is, of course, when you launch a jet off of an aircraft carrier, he, number 1, gets low on fuel immediately, and number 2, can't carry much ordnance because he has to take that catapult shot. So these guys would show up to support me in the combat that I was in, but they would always be short on fuel, always be short on ammunition. So that was a little bit tough, but those guys were definitely in the fight. The Harrier jump jet, these guys are coming off of amphibious shipping. In other words, not aircraft carriers per se, but helicopter carriers. As the Marine does it, the Marine Corps does it, we have Harriers as part of that composite squadron offshore. This is the JDAM. JDAM is actually a retrofit invention. Whoever invented it, I think, should get a Medal of Honor on the spot. Whoever came up with this idea to put this new guidance system on the front of these bombs is a genius. About $18,000 per retrofit. What this thing can do is take a dumb bomb, which these actually all are, and make it smart. They can drop this thing to within about 10 feet of where they want it using global positioning. What it does is basically gives the fins on the bomb a throw. In other words, it can move the bomb as it falls through the air and put it down where you want it. Most of the bombs I was calling in close air support of my troops in contact, were using JDAM, and it was fantastic. Tomahawk. We, the U.S. Navy, launched over 500 Tomahawk cruise missiles in the first 24 hours of the war, which in that 24-hour block was more Tomahawks than they had launched in the entire history of the U.S. Navy combined to that point. Because of that, these guys had to build what they call TLAM corridors. TLAM is Tomahawk Land Attack Munition. They build these huge sort of highways in the sky between the water all the way to Baghdad. So the air traffic controllers and the direct air support coordinators in theater had to guide all the airplanes around this big corridor through which these cruise missiles were flying on the way to Baghdad to send some people to go see Allah. And this, of course, is why we were all there. We, the ground support, the ground FACs, the aviators, all those ships, all the Tomahawks, all the ordnance, the money, the fuel, was all in support of these kids who were out there living in the dirt, dirty, hot, wet, unhappy, filthy, exhausted, hurt, just like all of you remember from the wars that you've been in. I went to the 1 Royal Irish Regiment, part of the 16th UK Air Assault Brigade. The British sort of see the world differently from us. We all kind of know that intuitively, but there was a very real sense, as we were back in Kuwait in January of '03 getting ready to go, that the British had no question that being there 10 or 15 years was completely reasonable. For them, remember, they come from a colonial background. It's very natural for them to do something like the Raj in India and to occupy a country to sort of help the little people and bring them up to a Western standard of living. It was very natural for them to be there, and they thought they were going to be there for a while. They work on a regimental system. It was not uncommon in my battalion, the 1 Royal Irish Regiment, to have people whose fathers and grandfathers had both been in that very battalion. When you go to a battalion in the British Army, you stay there for essentially your entire career. You keep moving up the ranks. You maybe go to a school and come back. You go to a staff tour, but you come back. The commander had been there as a lieutenant. We had one young lieutenant who had been babysat when he was a little boy by 2 of the sergeants major who were still in that battalion because his father had been there. So they have a very real sense of this regimental history and a very real sense of fighting for the Queen and Crown that we don't have here in this country per se. I put down here MEF 1914. The British had been here before. From 1914 to 1932, the British occupied Mesopotamia with the Mesopotamian Expeditionary Force, the MEF. So for them, it was sort of like a return to someplace they'd already been, as opposed to us going into this exotic land. And here they are. These are some of the lads that I worked with. These are members of the 1 Royal Irish Regiment, but these folks are from all over the United Kingdom. Ireland, Scotland, when I say Ireland, Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, Australia, South Africa, some Canadians. We had 19 guys from Fiji. It was quite a conglomerate of folks. And like all of us remember from all the conflicts we've been in, we did a lot of time doing this, studying maps and figuring out what it was we were going to do. We spent about 6 weeks planning for the first 6 hours of the war. We went over the border. It all went out the window in the first 3 minutes. And we were basically thinking on our feet from that point on, as everybody does. March 17, 2003, St. Patrick's Day. I was with an Irish Rifle Battalion on St. Patrick's Day. Not a bad place to be on that particular day in the Kuwaiti desert. I'm fairly certain that we were the only rifle battalion that brought bagpipes to the war. And here they are. Here are all the lads. These are riflemen. These are soldiers who just happen to know how to play the bagpipes. Like a kid from one of our battalions who can play guitar. This is just how they're raised. And on the morning of St. Patrick's Day, wherever they are in the world, the Royal Irish have a celebration. They always wake up at 05. The officers and the staff NCOs take a huge 55-gallon drum. They put all the booze they can find into it, mix it with hot tea, and they serve it to the troops in bed. In this case, in bed meant on the floor, but nonetheless, that's the tradition. So, of course, we participated in that, and things got progressively more rowdy as the day went on. In addition to all the British and Western sort of folks in this battalion, we had a company of Gurkhas. These are the Royal Gurkha Rifles right here, about 200 of them, from central Nepal. The Gurkhas, many of us know from our reading of history, are ferocious fighters. Very, very tough, feared fighters, especially in World War II. The Japanese were terrified of these guys, and for good reason. All these guys wanted to do was kill somebody with a knife. That was the ultimate sort of proof of manhood in the Nepalese culture, is to kill someone with a kukri fighting knife, which they all carry. The tallest guy in this picture is about 5'3". You walk behind these guys in the camp, and you would think somebody brought their little brother over to the theater. They were little teeny small guys. They weighed about 120 pounds. And they could hump farther, carry more weight, with no water, no food, for days on end, than any of us big, tough, strong Westerners with our training in the gym. These guys are all from roughly 10,000 feet. It's where they were raised, 10 to 12,000 feet. They all think that anybody who's raised with running water is a wimp. So living in the field for them is absolutely no problemo. For soft city boys like me, I whined and bitched the entire time. For these guys, living in the field was great because they had food, they had water, and they got to kill people. How much better could life be? There was a lot of this. This is my friend Richard. He was the liaison to the Royal Irish from the artillery. He was British artillery and was actually the battery commander. We did an awful lot of this. A lot of sitting around wearing these stupid gas masks. We had 10 to 12 drills a day in Kuwait. Drills and or false alarms. And we did a lot of this. This is us getting ready to go up to the border. The border's out here in the distance somewhere. And we just had regiments, divisions online like this. I never actually got up in a helicopter right before the war started, but someone did and took this photo, but it was just like this. And all we would do is we would get out of these vehicles and we'd dig a little hole right next to it and live in it. That was kind of our process. We went through a series of staging camps from about the 18th of March, the day after St. Patrick's Day, up to the 21st, moving progressively closer to the Iraqi border from the south. And then on the 21st, once more, dear friends, into the breach we went. This is a picture of me just north of the city of Amara in southern Iraq, and I'm sitting on a terrain sketch of the southern part of the country. This is one of the officer sort of academies they had there in the southern part of the country. And all these white flags are places that they knew we were going to go. It was fairly obvious to Saddam and his troops where we were coming from. There were 500,000 guys right there over the border. They could see us. And there was only 2 roads going in. They knew exactly where we were coming from, but they didn't know when. And the good thing we did, the smart thing we did, was we went over the border 18 hours early. I myself, and most of you most likely, have never been part of an operation that went ahead of schedule. But General Conway, who was the Marine commander in country, knew that if we went on some planned timeline, Saddam was going to sniff it out if we did the long, month-long bombing, in preparation for this war, he was going to blow all the bridges in the southern part of the country. He was going to set the entire southern half of the country on fire, all the oil fields, and he was going to stop us in our tracks. So instead of the month, 6-week-long bombardment all the infantry forces, like me, wanted, we got zero preparation. We went first and the air followed us. That was pretty unusual, but it turned out to be very smart because we really caught Saddam off guard. The night before that, you saw the picture of the Tomahawk. We did a lot of that on the night preparatory fires before we went across the border, taking out communications, power, and decapitating the regime. You must remember that the Arabs were trained by the Soviets. So the way they think is very regimented, very Soviet-style Cold War type field commander thinking. They don't think on their feet. So if there's nobody talking to them from above, they're basically help us out in the field. That's what we wanted. Here's our friends from one of the engineer groups welcoming us. We saw a lot of this on the way in. I took this photograph out the front of my Humvee. They didn't set nearly as many oil wells on fire because we caught them off guard. They were ready to burn the entire southern half of the country, as far as I could tell. And if they had destroyed the southern half of Iraq, they would have put that country on its knees for 30 years. Because there's no way to rebuild that structure that fast. And that's the economic lifeline, as we're all seeing now in the papers. That's the way we're going to get that country back on its feet, is getting that oil production back up to where it should be. This is how the Marines went. This is an Amtrak, Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. These guys went on these tracks. They drove on these tracked vehicles from the port in Kuwait all the way past Baghdad to Tikrit. These vehicles are all still there. And that's why the Marine Corps and our compatriots in the Army are back on their heels, because their equipment is being destroyed. In desert warfare, you go through equipment at roughly a 10-to-1 burn rate. In other words, if you have a 20-year lifespan on a track, in about 2 years, that thing is destroyed. And we knew that was going to happen, but we sacrificed the gear on behalf of the people. A lot of this kind of thing. A lot of this weird Mad Max kind of world. Kind of Mad Max meets Alexander the Great. A lot of these stripped down vehicles with guys sort of hanging out of them and gear hanging off the front and off the sides. And then you're back in biblical land, sort of trekking across places where Abraham and Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan had all walked. Here's the office. This is me on the morning of my first fight. Here's me right here. As usual, talking on the radio. Here's my comm chief, who I'm probably yelling at, telling him to hurry up and get somebody on the hook. Notice this shamrock here on his cover. Notice the lovely living conditions we're in. Here are the British artillery folks right next to me. I was able to reach out and literally touch my British artillery counterparts so we could fight the indirect fire war and the close air support war between British and American forces side by side. What we did bring with us, which was the single most important piece of gear, and I talked to a lot of guys across the theater, they agree, was a counter-battery radar called the Cobra. And this radar, if they shot at us, which they did a lot, if they shot anything at us, this radar could pick up the launch, it could get the spin of the projectile, the max order of the projectile, the speed at which it was coming, decipher what it was that shot it, give you a 10-digit grid back to where it came from before the thing hit the ground. So this guy right here, this is Pez, he was an E5 in the British Army, would yell out to me the coordinates, and here I am on the hook, getting aircraft up to go prosecute those targets. Primarily we were taking big artillery fire, big rockets, GHN type Soviet ordnance. We even got shot at by a couple of tanks. It was very exciting. Here's the office. Very, very plush. The charming thing about this Humvee was I cracked a piston at some point on the way up into the theater, and there's like in a Humvee there's a firewall, literally a firewall in the front of the passenger compartment. Well, whatever that firewall was wasn't working, so my Humvee was probably 140 degrees. Sitting with your knees against this thing, this engine heat was burning right through the metal and actually disintegrated the metal. And it was burning right onto my body the entire time. It was absolutely horrible. Here are my friends, the Cobras. This is what I flew in my previous life, so I was able to call these guys in and work them appropriately. And I knew what they were carrying. Here they're carrying 4 TOW and 4 Hellfire. The TOW is wire guided, the Hellfire is laser guided. So I knew I had to have both capabilities in order to use these folks. We saw a lot of this. There were an awful lot of guys putting their hands in the air. The Iraqis weren't nearly as ferocious as we had come to believe. There were some pretty good units up around Baghdad. The way Saddam worked it was a series of concentric rings from his personal residence, literally, out, all the way to the Kuwaiti border. So the farther away from Saddam you got, the worse the troops got. These guys, who we were seeing down in the southern part of the country, all looked like this. They were filthy, they were starving, they were exhausted. They've been out in the desert for God knows how long, years, literally, living in bunkers. I went down into some of the bunkers these guys were living in, and they were absolutely horrifying. I cannot believe that people could live like these guys were living. And it was under penalty of death. If they retreated a foot, Saddam had orders out to shoot any of his soldiers who pulled back. So what these guys did was they waited until night fell. They walked away from their positions. They stripped off their uniforms, put the robes back on, put a headdress on, and they were Bedouins, just walking across the land, not wanting trouble from anybody. But we saw a lot of hands in the air like this. A lot of weapons. That country was then and is now completely awash in ordnance. Rifles, grenade launchers, grenades, pistols, mortar rounds, artillery pieces, explosives, everything you could possibly imagine, we found. And mostly they did it in schoolyards. Their schoolyards had little there were courtyards, like you would have around a little school here, except they were surrounded by about 8-foot tall brick walls. They were perfect places for putting all their stuff. So what they would do is use these schoolyards as little caches for their field units to come in and out and get rearmed. Well, we found this stuff all over the place, everywhere we went. This is an Iraqi battalion that we sort of dethroned. This is the battalion commander here. This is the XO here. Here's me. This is my British battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Tim Collins. He was former SAS from the British Army, tough bastard from Belfast, no-nonsense kind of guy. This is Phil. Phil was British but was raised in Syria, so spoke fluent Arabic, and he was our interpreter. And these guys are negotiating with us on how to surrender their battalion. The interrogations, quote-unquote, we gave these guys were not like you see in the movies. It was much more like this. Tim spoke Arabic. He had been with the SAS. I don't even want to know what he was doing that he learned how to speak Arabic. But he understood how to deal with these people. The Arabs have a very different view of the world than Westerners do. For instance, their concept of truth is very different. Their concept of a fact is different from ours. Very frustrating for Americans, because we would sit down and say, where are all your troops? Go get them and bring them in. And then we'd have an hour-long discussion of, my great-grandfather once roamed this land, and he looked up at the stars for guidance from Allah. And we had all these long talks, and eventually you realized that to get things out of these people that you wanted, you had to become sort of Arab yourself and deal with them on their level. So we gave Iraq back to the Iraqis. This isn't going to run. I like to show videotape, especially when I'm talking to people like college students, graduate students, which I do a lot, and explain to them this whole idea that the U.S. media is putting forth now, that we are hated, we're occupiers, the Iraqis are all out to kill us, is true as far as it goes. But what I saw was much like what probably some of our World War II veterans saw when they liberated Paris. It was just like that. You can see these people here. They're yelling, they're screaming, they're waving, they're handing us things through the windows of our vehicles. They didn't actually spread flowers in our path like Dick Cheney said, but it was pretty much that idea. And these people were extremely pleased to see us because finally they could live without fear they were going to get dragged out of their houses, beaten, extorted, raped, or murdered by Saddam's henchmen. And you must realize that the way this guy ran his country, Saddam, when he was in power, from the late 1960s until 2003, was through fear and extortion and rape and murder. He was much like Hitler in the sense that he took his lieutenants, literally and figuratively, sent them down to the smallest villages, and he had a bath party headquarters in every single village in that country. So everybody knew that Saddam was watching everything you did. It was a very Stalinist type society. And here he is, the great leader, the great mustachioed one. And it was like this. It was very Stalinist. Everywhere you went was a photo of Saddam, a statue of Saddam. The currency had his picture on it. Every school room we went into, which was a lot because we lived in the schools quite often, had a huge photo of Saddam in every classroom. All the textbooks had a picture of Saddam on the cover. The flag was, do I have a picture of it? I'll show it to you in a second. The Iraqi flag was actually redesigned by Saddam when he took power to make it clear that it was Saddam's Iraq, not a free Iraq. Not an Iraq of the people, but an Iraq of Saddam. These are the townspeople in the city of Kurna when we tore down the statue of Saddam that was in the middle of the town square. We tore it down using a vehicle, ripped it off its pedestal, and then these people all jumped over the fence and took off their shoes and were beating the statue with their shoe. And I went to Collins and I said, I don't understand this. And he said, in the Arab world, the ultimate insult is to either show the bottom of your foot to someone, much less strike someone with the bottom of your foot. That's the ultimate insult in the Arab world. So to them, that was the ultimate insult to Saddam, that he was finally gone. These are my friends. We ended up camping out on a patrol up on the Iranian border in the backyard of this little farm family. Grandpa, son, and grandson. These people lived in mud huts, as you can imagine, illiterate, subsistence-level peasants. So there I am with my Harvard master's degree, sitting with these folks, and very much humbled to be around them. The Arabs are a very, very warm people, the people themselves, not the leadership, but the people. As someone said, if they have one chicken to the name of their family, they'll slaughter it for a stranger, and they were very much like that. We're sitting in a little outbuilding here, away from the main house. When we were getting ready to eat, you can see the water here, which they offered us, which I declined. When we were getting ready to eat, the mother, the sort of matriarch of the family, brought us the food. But she was clad head to toe in black, all the way down to her fingers, completely and utterly covered. And she wouldn't even step into the room because men were in there. She would take the tray and she handed it around the corner, and then we accepted it from our side and brought it into the room. That's the kind of culture these people live in. This is the flag. This is the picture I wanted. This is the flag of the old Iraq. I don't know what this says in Arabic, but it's essentially Saddam saying, this is my country. I am Iraq. And he's been heard to say that when he was in power. And if you watch the news coverage of his trial in Baghdad now, he continually says, I am Iraq. He was completely subsumed by this idea that he was the great pan-Arab leader that the Arab world needed. Here's me on the street in the city of Medina as we pushed forward. As you can see, I had absolutely no protection from an IED, a sniper, a mine, a bomb, somebody with a pistol, anything. Here I am right here. Notice the cheesy mustache. It's kind of hard to see. And here are all the Iraqis wanting to come and talk to us. And some of these folks actually spoke English pretty well. This is why we went right here, these little kids, especially her. These are adorable little kids, as they are anywhere in the world. But I wanted this little girl to have a better life than her mother and grandmother before her had had. I wanted her to be able to go to school and to have a job and to live as an equal with the men in her life. Here I am as part of a great camel migration. We all basically stopped in our tracks for a better part of a day while a Bedouin led his entire herd of umpteen thousand camels across. Those weapons of mass destruction that Saddam doesn't have, well, here's one of them right here. I have photographs of it. I have videotape of these things. Okay? This is an Al-Samud II missile. These are the ones that George Bush said, we know you have these. If you don't give them up to us or tell us where they are, we're going over your border. And he said, no, no, no. The UN inspectors have been here. I've been proven innocent of anything like this. Well, here they are. We're in, you can see the structure here. This is actually a soccer stadium. And as all Western armies do, we had to have a place where we could all be in one place in these cities. So soccer stadiums are always the best place to live. You could back your vehicles right up under the seating here, and it worked out great. Well, what he had done is he had moved these missiles underneath those sort of balustrades so the satellites couldn't see them from above. He isn't done. So, did Saddam Hussein have weapons of mass destruction? What we really wanted to find, of course, were the warheads. Not we in particular, but the Western world. And I'm convinced he did. I don't know where they are. They're probably buried somewhere. He probably sent them to Syria. He burned them. God knows what he did. But I'll tell you this. Young Marine Lance Corporal from one of the 1st Marines battalions, northern part of the country, up past Tikrit, was walking across a field, probably going to find a place to take a leak, and stumbled over something as he was going. And it was something really solid. It wasn't like a stick. So he backed off, and sort of kicked the sand away, and it was a big piece of metal sticking up out of the ground. So like a good Marine, he goes and finds his platoon sergeant, brings him out. They start moving this thing away, and they start digging into it, and they see a big piece of polished metal with a number on it. And they think, boy, that's kind of weird. So they get the engineers out there. They ended up uncovering an entire squadron of MiGs that they had buried in the sand because they knew we were coming. Now, if he can bury an entire squadron of MiG fighter planes, does anybody think he can bury 30, 40, 50 pounds worth of liquid somewhere? I think so. That's the kind of guy he was. Not a great picture, but I wanted to show you the spot I'm standing on. This is the Tigris. This is the Euphrates. So this point where I'm standing is the Garden of Eden, in theory. In fact, the Iraqis had quite a good little scam going where the little school village children would come up and offer to take you to the actual tree of Abraham for a very low cost of about 10 dinar. They would take you over to the tree, which was, of course, just right over there. And they would run you over there by the hand, they'd show you, and they would sort of caper around. It was really cute. But the point being that when we went to someplace like this, we realized that we were in biblical land. It was difficult to sort of match that with this sort of weird, open desert, Mad Max kind of post-apocalypse world to realize you were back in a place where Abraham had walked, in the ancient city of Ur. The fact that as far as historians are concerned, Alexander made it to Baghdad at one point, Alexander the Great. Muslim armies in the time of the Crusades have made it all the way to Paris. These are a very expansive and conquering type people. So for us, it was interesting to be sort of in that weird mesh of cultures between what we did then and what we have read about in the Bible since we were kids. What are we going to do now? This country has been ruled by a dictator since 1958, when Saddam Hussein's uncle took charge. Saddam was in prison at the time. He broke out. He then assassinated his uncle and took power. He then took over the entire country by taking over the Senate. And the way he did that was he had a room just like this, an auditorium, where the great leader himself sat. This is in 1967. Locked the doors behind the entire Senate once they had all arrived, with his guards on the outside of the doors keeping everybody in. He then assassinated 2/3 of the people in the room. And then he looked at the other third and said, "Will you follow me?" And there was a fairly unanimous decision that yes, in fact, we will. That's how he took power, and that's how he kept power, was through that kind of fear. The 22 countries in the Arab world, generally considered the Arab world, combined, 22 countries have a GDP less than that of Spain alone. They have an internet connectivity rate roughly the same as sub-Saharan Africa. What you have in the Arab world is you have Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and then you have everybody else. And these two countries, this is why you always see the Bush administration or the Clintons or Bush 1 or whoever cozying up to people that all of us in this room think are dictators, which in fact they are. But we have to have a friend somewhere in that world. And these two countries are where we do that. Egypt and Saudi, by far the most powerful of the Arab nations. These madrasas in Pakistan, there are 39,000 of them in Pakistan and going over into Afghanistan. A madrasa is essentially like a boys' club would be for us. This is where young boys go to have a sense of self and have a sense of belonging. And what they do there is they are inculcated into an angry, muscular version of Islam. And that is where all the people who flew airplanes into the World Trade Center or are setting bombs in the roads in Baghdad now have all come from. Much like a street gang in Los Angeles or the mafia, maybe, among Italians and Sicilians, it gives them a place to be, a place to belong. They're poor, they're uneducated, they have no hope of a job or a future. So they can go to these madrasas and have an elderly man and some older brother figures accept them into their embrace. And this is where these kids are all coming from. 39,000 of them in Pakistan alone. That is what all of us in this room and in this country are all up against. Islam has not been through an enlightenment or reformation. There is no separation, either literally or figuratively or emotionally, between church and state in that world. The church is the state and the state is the church, and ne'er the twain shall be separated, unlike the way we view it. We view church as one thing and our government as something else entirely. Muslims don't see it that way. Muslims also are not able to use rationality when it comes to large issues facing the world, which is why you see things like we did several weeks ago with the reaction to the comments of the Pope by the Muslim world. They are not able to separate what their religious beliefs are and who they are as a people. And that's why we as Americans are having such a hard time understanding how to deal with the angry radical Islam that we see now. I love this quote from Teddy Roosevelt. This is actually a quote that he said to his son, his little son, when he was in the White House. His son and his daughters were all having a water fight, a squirt gun war, and Teddy called his son aside and said, the point is to always do something quickly, because if you don't, the other fellow will. Well, that is what we did. That is why we went into Iraq in the first place. I can tell you, as a guy who was there with the infantry forces, no one ever said to us anything about finding weapons of mass destruction. No one ever said to us anything about avenging 9/11. We were there to get rid of Saddam Hussein, who we know, as far as we know, has murdered 300,000 people, and the number is climbing as they uncover more mass graves in the southern part of the country. So the people who insist that we go into Darfur and places like that to address the genocide in those countries are, I think, correct. But they cannot then also say we should not have gone into Iraq to do the exact same thing. This guy, Saddam, was Hitler, he was Pol Pot, Idi Amin. He was the sort of guy who had no compunction about wiping out entire villages if they stood up to his rule. So that is the kind of people that we're facing right now. The genocide that we stopped in Iraq has been essentially forgotten. When was the last time you read about a mass grave being uncovered in southern Iraq? Probably never, if even ever. I can tell you that there are people there now, huge teams of people, digging up graves. When Americans and some British and Australian folks as well go into these little towns, they start talking to the villagers say, we know where everyone is buried. Please, please take us to where these people are with your equipment, and we want to find our family members. These villagers sometimes will fall to their knees and dig with their bare hands, trying to find sons or husbands or brothers or fathers who were murdered by the regime. So that right there is why we went. Now, it may not be why we're still there, but the fact that we did the right thing in the first place, I think, is justification for what we were doing in Iraq. I've gone way over my time. Zot, thank you. Are there any questions for me about anything? Please, anybody. Okay, I sure will. Any questions? This is my email address if someone needs to get hold of me. Sir.
Any big difference between how the Shiites and the Sunnis reacted to the American presence?
There was a big difference. The farther north we went in the country, the more sort of sinister the feeling became. In the Shiite part of the country, of course, these people were not friends of Saddam. Remember, he had repressed the southern villages when they had fallen in behind us in Desert Storm. And sort of one of the arguments about Iraq is, well, you abandoned us the first time. You came in from Kuwait in 1991, and then you just disappeared and left us to face Saddam, which they did to their peril. Saddam also had drained the marshes. In the southern and eastern part of the country, up against southern Iran, is the land of the marsh Arabs. And this truly is biblical land. He had drained those marshes and ruined a way of life people had had for up to 8,000 years in retaliation for what they had done. Point being, the Shiites were very happy to see us. The Sunni, who are primarily clustered around Baghdad, as a group, not so pleased to see us because, of course, they were much like the apartheid government in South Africa. They were a minority ruling a majority through force. So all of a sudden we took away all their power and they were nobodies again, without their maximum leader there with them, and the Senate, which was all, of course, Sunni, and in fact Wahhabi, even more to the point. Without those people there, suddenly these Sunni, who were quite accomplished professional people, had nothing. No jobs, no money, no nothing. So the farther north we went, yeah, it got a lot more ugly. And of course, you see in the paper every day the sort of the fighting that's going on now. But I will tell you, a lot of that is coming from over the borders as well. Sir.
Has anyone ever attempted to present this type of briefing to Congress or to New York and the Washington Post?
Has anyone tried to give this briefing to Congress? Well, I tried. No one was terribly interested. There is, to me, a resonance in the argument that people who have not been to war should not send others to war. I can kind of see that argument. Not that Franklin Roosevelt was any great leader, or Ronald Reagan, or any of these presidential figures, but the argument that you need to have been there to understand that, I think, does have some sense. I read a lot about the first Bush administration from a historical standpoint, and Colin Powell made that very point. Colin Powell, a lot of times, was sitting in the room full of people ready to go invade the world, none of whom had ever heard a shot fired in anger. So, I think that Congress, the President, needs to hear this sort of thing. And I think that they are now in a hunkering down mode. Politicians tend to hunker down when things get bad and hope it all blows over and goes away. And what is the headline every day now? It's this weirdo representative sending emails to his pages. Okay? That's pushed the whole war in Iraq off the front pages. Maybe good, maybe not. But nonetheless, politicians tend to hunker down when they get attacked. I think the most clear thinking about this war is coming from John McCain. Not because he has any particular insight into it, but he has obviously the moral gravity of having fought and been in prison in Vietnam. But more to the point, he's thinking about it, I think, very clearly. The only way, this is my opinion, editorial comment, the only way to make this country work is to split it into three parts. Kurdistan in the north, a Sunni sort of heartland, and a Shiite south. That's the only way it's going to work, because otherwise you're throwing people together who have a deep-seated hatred for each other, and it simply isn't going to work any other way. It's like North and South Korea. They are never going to unify. You saw on my second slide here that I had been to Harvard for graduate school. I went to the Kennedy School of Government. And in that program, I had quite a few classmates from other countries, including one female who was from Kurdistan. Now, this is back in the late 90s, before this all started. She had been held in prison from the time she was about 12 till she was about 15. A little girl now, a young girl in prison, because of what her father had done. They imprisoned the entire family. So this is someone who has no love for Saddam, trust me. She ended up being the Minister of Public Works in the new the CPA, when that was established in the Green Zone. What she says is Kurdistan is not part of Iraq. The Mesopotamian Expeditionary Force, the 1914 to 1932, I showed you before, the British essentially partitioned this country and just sort of drew lines on a map and called it good. They sort of created Kuwait out of that and didn't take into account tribal and ethnic ties, which are far stronger than national ties in this world. If you look at southern Iran, southern Iraq, northern Kuwait, northern Saudi Arabia, going all the way around to Syria, that is what people have called the Shiite Crescent. And indeed it is. Those countries pulled together, they are closer to people across the border of their same tribe or their ethnicity than they are to people inside their borders because some Westerner drew it on a map. The same is true in the north. From Kurdistan all the way north into Turkey, those people are also ethnically, religiously, and through tribal ties closer to one another over the border than they are to people inside what is called their country. This is why Saddam was never able to unify the Arab world into this big pan-Arab brotherhood and make himself the great Saladin that he wanted himself to be. It was never going to work because the Arabs don't think that way. They're tied closer to tribe and culture than they are to lines on a map that were drawn, in this case, by a British officer. More questions, please. Anybody? Any more questions? Okay, this is my email address. Please do write me, and also Zod is my contact information. Thank you.
Worth the trip.
Great, thank you. Oops.